On the morning of January 1st, 1930, the front page of the New York Times was still saturated with blind optimism. Economists dismissed the great crash of October 1929 as a healthy correction to cool an overheated market, and the Harvard Economic Society released a report predicting a vigorous recovery to begin within the first half of the year. However, their prediction was a civilizational miscalculation. The unemployment rate, which was less than 3% in 1929, soared to 8.9% by the end of 1930. By 1932, it would reach a catastrophic 25%, leaving 12 million Americans, a quarter of the workforce, without a livelihood. The Industrial Production Index plummeted by nearly 50% from its peak. For Arthur, these numbers were not mere ink on paper. They were the sum total of the murderous despair radiating from the eyes of thousands of rivals gathered at labor markets at 4 a.m. in sub-zero temperatures. Arthur felt his human dignity gradually eroding as he watched his once crisp suits become wrinkled and his shoe soles wear thin. He was no longer a provider. He was merely a dot on a Bureau of Labor Statistics chart, an excess human. In the breadlines, former colleagues avoided eye contact, for in each other's gaze, they saw the reflection of their own grim future. Behind Arthur's eviction and his family's displacement to a shantytown lay the cold, merciless philosophy of the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. Having served under 3 presidents as a titan of finance, Mellon chose to be a ruthless inquisitor in the face of the crisis. He famously advised President Hoover, "Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people." This became the infamous stain on economic history known as Liquidationism. Mellon believed that government intervention would only prolong the misery by sustaining unfit businesses and individuals. Under his watch, 1,352 banks collapsed in 1930 alone. Arthur's life savings, meticulously built over 15 years, vanished into scraps of paper the moment the bank doors were shuttered. While the state stood idly by, tethered to a blind faith in the market's self-healing powers, ordinary citizens like Arthur were being crushed within the massive gears of a failing machine. In May 1931, a telegram reached New York announcing the failure of Kreditanstalt, Austria's largest bank. It was a cardiac arrest for European finance, a signal for a global chain reaction of defaults. The crisis moved like a row of dominoes to London, and on September 21, 1931, an event occurred that shook the very foundations of the world economy. The British Empire officially announced its abandonment of the gold standard. In that era, the gold standard was the Bible of capitalism. When the promise to convert banknotes into gold at any time was broken, the values of global currencies spiraled out of control. Led by Britain, nations embarked on beggar thy neighbor policies, artificially devaluing their currencies to gain an export edge. Arthur stood before a newsstand, a chill running down his spine as he read the headline, "Pound collapses, world trade paralyzed." This was no longer just a Wall Street problem. As the sole promise sustaining capitalism disintegrated, the world was being sucked into a vortex of global economic warfare, fueled by mutual distrust. The very concept of money that Arthur had believed in was evaporating. On June 17, 1930, President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, arguably the most fatal political blunder in history. At the time, 1,028 prominent economists had sent a petition imploring the president to veto it, warning that the law would ignite a global trade war and isolate America. However, Hoover succumbed to the pressure of politicians desperate for votes. The act imposed a staggering average tariff of 53% on over 20,000 imported items. Trading partners like Europe and Canada retaliated instantly. The result was catastrophic. World trade evaporated by 66%, falling from $2.9 billion in 1929 to just $1.1 billion in 1932. Numerous export-oriented companies that were the primary borrowers from the bank where Arthur once worked went bankrupt within months. While selling apples, Arthur wandered near the docks and saw mountains of flour and agricultural products rotting in warehouses because they could not be exported. This bizarre contradiction, people starving while food rotted behind political barriers, was a death sentence passed by ignorance upon humanity. The most haunting spectacle of the Great Depression was starvation in the midst of plenty. As agricultural prices fell below production costs, farmers faced total ruin. Arthur read a shocking report of Iowa farmers pouring thousands of gallons of fresh milk into rivers to protest falling prices. In California, mountains of oranges were soaked in kerosene and set ablaze. In Nebraska, farmers plowed under their wheat instead of harvesting it. The government even ordered the slaughter of 6 million young pigs to be buried in the ground to support prices. Arthur's children whimpered from hunger, surviving on a single bowl of thin soup, while across the nation, food was being systematically destroyed. This was the cruelest evidence that the mechanics of the free market had completely broken down. In a market where effective demand had vanished, supply became a curse rather than a blessing. Standing in a bread line, Arthur envisioned the milk flowing down the river and abandoned his last hope in the system. Unable to pay rent, Arthur moved his family to a massive shantytown on the edge of New York's Central Park. People called these wretched dwellings Hoovervilles, a name dripping with mockery of the president's failed optimism. These homes were constructed from scrap plywood, rusted corrugated iron, and old tar paper scavenged from dumps. Every morning, Arthur combed through trash heaps for clothes for his children and tin cans to fashion into a makeshift stove. People called the old newspapers they slept under Hoover blankets, and their empty pockets, turned inside out, Hoover flags. The air in the Hooverville was thick with despair, resentment, and the stench of rotting food. Middle-class fathers who, until yesterday, had handled documents in Wall Street offices, now sat on the dirt floor mending rags. Arthur was afraid to meet anyone's eyes, for in them remained only the shadows of souls that had already died. In the autumn of 1930, the streets of New York were occupied by the most sorrowful sight in economic history: the emergence of the apple seller. With export routes blocked and apple inventories piling up, the International Apple Shippers Association began providing apples on credit to the unemployed at $1.75 per crate. Arthur joined that line. The hands that once discussed the valuation of thousands of dollars in stocks now held a single, damp, red apple. He bowed his head to passers-by, selling apples for 5 cents apiece. There were over 6,000 such apple sellers in New York alone. This did not merely signify individual poverty. It meant that the pride of the American middle class and the value of labor were being sold on the street for a nickel. Arthur wrote in his diary, "Sold 20 apples yesterday. I could buy bread for the children, but it feels as if my soul was sold off for less than a cent." In the summer of 1932, the most heartbreaking procession in history gathered in Washington, D.C. 40,000 veterans of World War I and their families, known as the Bonus Army. They peacefully demonstrated, demanding immediate payment of the service bonuses promised for 1945. In a situation where children were starving, a bonus 13 years away was meaningless. However, the Hoover administration's response was merciless. General Douglas MacArthur, ignoring the president's orders to halt, deployed cavalry and 6 tanks. Among the commanders were future heroes George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower. Tear gas was fired at national heroes, and soldiers with fixed bayonets burned the tents of their former comrades. Arthur saw a photograph of an old veteran collapsed in the smoke, still wearing his medals. It was the moment the state rescinded its social contract with its citizens through physical violence. This event remained the darkest stain on American democracy, and Arthur ceased to believe in his country.
In the pit created by the economic collapse, madness began to take root.
From the old radio in the Hoovervilles came news from across the Atlantic. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had seized power in Germany, promising bread and work. In Italy, Mussolini flaunted the supposed efficiency of fascism. Even within the United States, voices claiming democracy has failed grew louder. Fascist organizations like the Silver Shirts expanded, preaching white supremacy, and some wealthy elites even plotted a coup shortly after Roosevelt's inauguration. Arthur stood in a breadline and wondered, if liberty and voting cannot feed me, wouldn't a powerful dictator who gives us bread be better? In a place where human dignity had vanished, democracy was a luxury. The world was falling for the allure of fascism. Hunger paralyzed reason, and Arthur felt this terrifying shift in his very bones.
Not everyone shared the suffering. Titans of industry from companies like DuPont and General Motors formed the American Liberty League. They denounced every meager relief effort by the government as socialist tyranny. When Arthur sold apples, the wealthy elites in luxury limousines passing by dismissed him as a product of laziness and moral hazard. At the time, the concept of social security did not exist. All Arthur received was the cold gaze of mainstream society, which insisted poverty is a personal sin. The crisis, rather than uniting the community, turned the gap between the haves and the have-nots into a concrete wall. Arthur looked at the uncrossable river between himself and the gentleman in the limousine and realized how deeply fractured American society had become. While finance and politics crumbled, the earth itself turned its back on humanity. In the early 1930s, massive dust storms known as the Dust Bowl began to scour the American Midwest. This was not a pure natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe caused by over-farming. The relentless plowing of grasslands during the wheat boom of World War I had stripped the land of its protective cover. When a severe drought hit, 350 million tons of topsoil rose into the air, displacing 2,500,000 farmers. Even in New York, Arthur trembled as he wiped away the yellow dust seeping through his window frames. It was the soil of Oklahoma. Crops in the West withered, and food prices fluctuated wildly. Financial collapse, political failure, and ecological destruction. Arthur was now convinced that the civilization humanity had built was coming to an end. Nature itself seemed revolted by human greed. By early 1933, the American financial system was essentially on its deathbed. Starting with Michigan, every state declared a bank holiday, shuttering all bank doors. The very existence of cash evaporated from the market. When Arthur tried to buy bread with the few cents he had earned selling apples, the shopkeeper chased him away, shouting, "I don't take money. Bring me something I can eat." All of America regressed into a primitive barter economy. People starved while their money remained locked in banks they couldn't access. In the empty streets, Arthur realized how hollow the human promises sustaining numbers and paper currency truly were. A world where you couldn't buy bread, not because you lacked money, but because money no longer functioned as money, was the most extreme terror Arthur had ever experienced. By the end of 1932, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had hit a rock bottom of 41.22 points, an 89% decline from its peak. National income was halved, and over 5,000 banks had disappeared. Yet, in this pit of despair, the seeds of change were germinating. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the politician in a wheelchair who had overcome polio, was preparing his entrance, shouting for a New Deal for the forgotten man. Part 3 ends here, but Arthur's struggle was far from over. In Part 4, we will explore the massive national experiment Arthur will face, and how the shadow of war would either heal the scars of the Great Depression or carve them even deeper. We begin the final story of how the social systems we enjoy today were born from blood and tears. Thank you for watching.